Hi everyone. Today we are going to study about a very fascinating and natural phenomena that is observed by everyone, that is pollination. Pollination is not just a fascinating natural phenomena in plants, but it is an essential ecological survival function, we can say. It is pollination. Uh, it is the act of transferring pollen grains from the male anther of the flower to the female stigma of the flower. The goal of every living organism, including plants, is to create offspring for the next generation. One of the ways that plants can produce offspring is by making seeds. Seeds contain the genetic information to produce new plants. So, flowers are the tools that plants use to make their seeds. Okay. The basic parts of the flowers are, or we all know, the petals, sepals, gynoecium, and androecium. Okay, if you look at this picture, this is a mature flower, and you can see the different parts present in the mature flower. Okay. These are the sepals, or you can call it as calyx, and this attractive colored petals or corolla. And there are two reproductive organs, that is female reproductive organ, that is gynoecium, which consists of ovary. Uh, Inside the ovary, you will see ovules, and this is the style, and this is stigma. Okay, stigma is facilitated so that the anthers or pollen grains will come and stick here. Okay, so this is gynoecium, whereas this part is androecium. It is a male part of the flower, and it consists of, you'll see, this is the long one is filament, and this is anther. Inside the anther, you will see many pollen grains. Okay, so this is the structure of the mature flower. Today, we are going to study about in detail about the pollination mechanism that is that occurs in the plants. Pollination is nothing but the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower. In other words, we can say pollination is the act of transferring pollen grains. This is the pollen grains from the flower or male anther of the flower to the female part, that is stigma of another flower or the same flower. Okay. The goal of every living organism, including plants, I have told you, is to create offspring for the next generation. Through pollination mechanism, these plants, all the plants, they produce seeds, and that's how they can produce their offsprings. In this lesson, we are going to study in detail about what is the mechanism of pollination, different types of pollination mechanisms included, and what are the pollinators, that are the vectors that help in pollination mechanism, and what are the modifications that plants has made for effective pollination. In general, there are two types of pollination mechanisms. One is self-pollination, the other one is cross-pollination. Self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination is a basic type of pollination, whereas the cross-pollination, we can say it is a complex type. In self-pollination, pollen grains from the anther fall directly onto the stigma of the same flower. I repeat, pollen grains from the anther fall directly onto the stigma of the same flower. If you look at this picture, this is a plant, And you will see uh, there are four flowers: F1, flower 1, flower 2, flower 3, and flower 4. And this is another plant. It consists of two flowers. Okay, F1, you can say D1, D2. Okay, so self-pollination, if you look here, the pollen grains, this is the anther and the pollen grains, you can see the pollen grains from the anther fall directly onto the stigma of the same flower, same flower. So this arrow mark indicates the falling of the anther on the stigma of the same flower. So this is called as self-pollination. Whereas if you see the cross-pollination, look at this picture. This is cross-pollination. This is one plant and this is another plant. And uh, but they are of same species, genetically similar plants. Okay. This anther, the pollen grain from this plant, it is falling on the stick or reaching on the stigma of another plant, another flower on different plant. So this kind of pollination mechanism is called as cross pollination. I repeat, transfer of pollen from anther of one flower, say this is D1 flower, right? So to the stigma of a different flower. We said this, we have named F1, F2, F3, F4 flowers. So from D1 to F4 flower, the transfer of pollen grain is reaching the stigma of F4, F4 flower. So this kind of pollination mechanism is called as cross pollination, and it is a bit complex type. Yeah, pollination is, as we have discussed earlier, it is of two kinds: self-pollination and cross-pollination. Again, self-pollination is of two types: autogamy and geitonogamy. We will discuss it this, later. But look at this picture. This cross-pollination is uh, can can be carried by different means, because pollination is, I told you, pollen will fall on the same flower or different flower. If how does the pollen get from one flower to another flower? Uh, Flowers must rely on vectors. Okay, for cross-pollination, flowers must rely on some vectors which carries this and the pollen from one flower to another flower. So these may be, we can call it as vectors or factors. So there are some living factors or non-living factors that can carry these pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of another flower. Abiotic factors includes wind, water, etc. And biotic factors includes insects, bats, snails, birds, etc. Okay. If the pollination mechanism occurs through abiotic factors like wind, it is called as anemophily. If the pollination occurs by water, through water, then it is called as water pollination or hydrophily. If the living factors are included in the pollination mechanism, then there uh, it is called as biotic pollination mechanism. And if the insects are used or insector acts as a vector for pollination mechanism, that is called as entomophily. If you take biotic factors or any living beings helping in cross-pollination, acting as a vector for pollination, it is an unintended process, okay, unintended consequence of animal activity on a flower. The pollinator is often eating or collecting pollen from, for its protein or other nutritional characteristics. and or it visit a flower for sipping the nectar. Uh, and the flower, when pollen grains attach themselves to the animal's body. Okay, then when animal visits another flower of the same reason, pollen can follow onto the flower's stigma and may result in successful reproduction of the flower. So, if bats or used bats, the pollination occurs by bats is called as directively. If the pollination is occurred by snails, అంటే నత్తగుల్లలు అంటాం కదా, so if it is occurred by snails, that is called as malacophily. If the pollination occurs through birds, it is called as ornithophily. Okay. Now, we'll see in detail a self-pollination mechanism. In self-pollination mechanism, the plant can fertilize itself. Okay. Whereas in cross-pollination mechanism, the plant needs a vector, or you can call it as a pollinator, or a wind, or a water, to get the pollen to another flower of the same species. Okay. This in self-pollination, the transfer, as we have already seen, the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of either of the same flower or genetically similar flower. Let me repeat. This is transfer of pollen grains from anther of a flower to the stigma of same flower or genetically similar flower is called as self-pollination. Don't get confused. See, it is of two types. Self-pollination is of two types. Now you can understand it better. First one is autogamy. Autogamy, if you see the definition of autogamy, transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma takes place within the same flower. Okay, see here, this is one flower and anther is pollinating the stigma of the same flower. So this is called as autogamy. Auto means same. Okay. Look at here. This is F1 flower and this is F2 flower, we can say, and this is F3 flower. F3 flower self-pollination is by means of autogamy. Now look at these two pictures. This is F1 and F2 flowers, we say. Here the pollen from this anther is falling on the stigma of another flower on the same plant. So this kind of self-pollination is called as Geitonogamy. To carry out autogamy, that means the plant can fertilize itself, the flower can fertilize with its own anther. The plants have their own adaptations to carry out autogamy. That is, anther first adaptation is anther stigma synchronization, and that means stigma and anther, they synchronize with each other. And the second mechanism, or the second modification, or you can say adaptation by the plant, is position of distance between anther and stigma. Position of distance between anther and stigma. The distance, like the distance between anther and stigma, and the heights of anther and stigma. So the position or distance between anther and stigma also play a role in autogamy. Okay, in homogamy, anther and stigmas of chasmogamous or open flowers mature at same time. Chasmogamous flowers means they are open flowers, and anthers and stigmas, both of them, they mature at the same time. So Whenever they mature at the same time, there is every possibility for the anther, the pollen, to reach the stigma of the same flower. Okay. In cleistogamous flowers, this is chasmogamous flowers in open flowers. They anther and stigma mature at different times. I'm sorry, at the same time. Whereas in cleistogamous flowers, that means closed flowers, the anther dehisces inside closed flowers, and growth of the style brings the pollen grains in contact with the seed. For example, in Violaceae and Barminaceae. Look at this picture. This is an open flower, Chasmogamous flower. Here, both of them, the stamens, and this is the stigma. They mature at the same time. So it facilitates self-pollination. Whereas here, if you look at these flowers, they're closed flowers. Hmm. When in such cases, what happens? The anther dehisces inside the closed flowers. Growth of the style brings the pollen grains in contact with the stigma. Okay. Before the flower opens, already fertilization takes place. That means the anther inside this closed flower already dehisces. That means already opens up and pollen grain is released inside the flower, and the stigma or the gynecium is ready to collect the pollen grains. So this is how it is facilitated for self-pollination mechanism. The other kind of self-pollination mechanism we said is Geitonogamy, right? So in Geitonogamy, the pollen grains of one flower are transferred to the stigma of another flower belonging to the same plant. Okay, what are the modifications the plant has adopted is they are similar to xenogamy or cross-pollinated plants. Xeno is new or foreign. Okay, so xenogamy or cross-pollination flower, cross-pollination flowers. Now we will see the advantages and disadvantages of self-pollination, um, self-pollination plants. So the first advantage of the self-pollination plant is maintenance of parental characters or purity of the race. Okay. Because in self-pollination, there is no diversity in the genes, and therefore the purity of the race is maintained because there is no chance for another plants or another flowers genetical material will not be um, transfer to the other flower. So it maintains the parental characters or purity of that particular race is maintained indefinitely because for many generations, the parental characters and the purity of the race is indefinitely maintained. And this, because of this advantage, these plants or self-pollinated plants used to maintain in hybridization experiments for maintaining the pure lines. Okay? And whatever the little pollen is produced by self-pollinated plants is enough to fertilize its uh, stigma. So there is no need for the plant to produce large number of pollens. And because the flower need not to attract insects or any other vectors for pollination mechanism, there is no development or the flower develop any devices for attracting insect pollinators. So these are the advantages of the self-pollination. Okay. Coming to the disadvantages, these self-pollinated plants, they cannot produce new characters because the parental characters are maintained, so they can't produce new characters. And vigor and vitality of the race decreases with the prolonged self-pollination. That means continuous self-pollination result in weak progenesis. So weak progenera will be formed because of this continuous self-pollination. And these plants, after a long time, they are susceptible for diseases. So immunity to diseases decreases. So, and also whenever there is any environmental change, these plants are the first one to succumb. So because there's no, they don't have any adaptability to um, thrive in the changed environments. So adaptability to changed environment or reduce. So these are the advantages and disadvantages of self-pollination.